right.
All right. Well, hi, Joe. I really appreciate you meeting with me. Could you just give an introduction of who you are, maybe your background and your current podcast and things like that?
Sure. My name is Joe Heschmeyer, and I've been doing apologetics in one way, shape, or form since 2009. I had grown up Catholic, but like many Catholics, didn't have a very deep understanding of why Catholics believed what they believed, and wasn't sure if I believed those same things. And then in college, I had my RA at the time was a friend of mine who is now a Catholic priest, and he was extremely helpful in answering the questions that I had. But then eventually, I went on to law school and had to really delve into a lot of those things myself, and was stunned by the depth and the richness of it. And so I got really annoying with all of my like non-Catholic and non-Christian, friends and classmates at Georgetown, and this is, even though it's technically like a Catholic school, a lot of people I was in class with were not serious about faith. We're not people of faith of any kind, and so I found myself trying to force these conversations and being aware I was being annoying, but trying not to be. So I started a blog in 2009 called Shameless Popery, and I did that for years and years. And eventually I finished law school, was a lawyer for a while, went to seminary, got degrees in philosophy and theology, and now did some other stuff in between. And now I work full-time for Catholic Answers and have turned the blog into a weekly podcast. Actually, right now is twice a week,
Awesome.
Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so it's been a real joy to get to share. Really, a lot of it is just sharing cool things that I've found that I wish I had known as a Catholic, and that I'm finding repeatedly Protestant listeners are saying they wish they had known as well. I do some stuff, like the normally answering atheism and everything else, but a lot of the stuff that I've focused on has been looking at things maybe from a conservative Protestant direction in terms of the kind of the objections I'm used to hearing, growing up in the Midwest, objections I had heard and didn't really necessarily know an answer to back then. Now I can say, okay, great. Here's this objection. It makes sense. It sounds good, but there is an answer. Here's what that answer is. So I've enjoyed the back and forth with a lot of different people, and I hope that they've enjoyed it as much as I have. But that's more or less my story.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to do a little promo on your book. Love it. I haven't finished it yet, but I just wanted to ask, what was your inspiration for writing this?
Yeah. So there's two inspirations. When the bishops announced they were doing this 3-year kind of process of helping people to fall in love with Jesus and the Eucharist in a deeper way. So there'd been some Pew Research studies that suggested a lot of people who call themselves Catholic didn't really understand what the Catholic Church taught about the Eucharist, about transubstantiation. It wasn't just that they rejected it, it's that they didn't even know the basics in the first place. Now, if you delve a little deeper on that, most of the people who were in that disbelieving, ignorant category were people who never go to church. And so even though they call themselves Catholic, you can have the most amazing preaching in the world, and if they're literally not there, it's pretty tricky. So it's a complicated kind of problem to solve. But if you saw the National Eucharistic Congress, all of that is part of this recognition, I think, on the part of the U.S. bishops that we need to be a people more in love with Jesus, and more in love with Jesus in the Eucharist in a particular way. And so at Catholic Answers, we thought, well, we should really have more stuff specifically about the Eucharist. We have a lot of books that talk about the Eucharist in a chapter or something. Almost everybody's conversion account is going to be what happens when the light bulb comes on about the Eucharist. Yeah. But we didn't have a ton of stuff that was just about the Eucharist specifically. And so Todd, my editor, called me one day and was like, do you have anything you'd be passionate about writing? Like, he's like, I don't want you to just like do something because it's timely, but are you passionate about anything related to the Eucharist? And I was like, yes, because years ago I'd been in seminary, and I was for 4 weeks at the cathedral in Tallinn, Estonia, in Northeast Europe. The tiny country borders Russia. And while I was there, I was hindered by the fact I don't speak Estonian. And so I felt like I was trying my best, but I was kind of hitting a wall, and it felt like kind of a fruitless time, where I'm showing up, God, but I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing or how, I'm trying to be docile, trying to be obedient, not sure what I'm supposed to do here. And there were some missionaries of charity there, and they speak English. It's Mother Teresa's group, and English is the official language. So wherever they come from, all of them know English. So if you ever see the MCs, wherever you are in the world, you found some English speakers. And so I said, well, maybe I could do some talks for them. And so the pastor said, basically he'd think about it. And then finally, I think it was my last week that I was there. Maybe I don't remember. It might have been second to last week. But either way, he comes to me one day and says, I talked to the Mother Superior of the local MCs. I hope I'm getting all the terminology right. And they'd like you to do 3-hour-long talks on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And this is Monday. And 3-hour-long talks that I don't know the subject matter of. And for a group of really holy women religious that I'm like, what am I going to tell them? And what even is the topic? And he's like, oh, you'll have to find out tonight because we have the English Mass on Monday nights. So Monday night comes around, the MCs are there, and I ask, so I hear him giving 3 talks for you guys on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And she goes, no. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I'm like, oh, tomorrow. And so it turned out on Monday night, I'm finding out I'm going to be giving an hour-long reflection to people who know and love Jesus in the Eucharist already. And she originally wanted all 3 to be on the Eucharist, but I talked her down to 2 on the Eucharist, 1 on Mary, because I was like, I don't know if I have 3 hours worth of things to say that you couldn't already tell me better. And so then I went back from Mass and went to adoration and just spent a lot of time in front of our Lord in the Eucharist. And the basic outline of that book is what kind of emerged from some pretty intense cramming prayer as I tried to not make a complete fool of myself. And so, yeah, thanks be to God. That was the seed that was planted, and this is the book that kind of resulted from it.
That's amazing. I just wanted to tell you, I feel like I've been fairly acquainted with a lot of Eucharistic arguments, but there are things in here that I had never heard before. You made a point about Protestants can be against the idea that we get salvation through the act of eating something, but how we all believe that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's how sin entered the world. And so there was some spiritual aspect of eating conveyed something in that way. And so it's just is so fitting that it also is conveyed in a salvific manner, of course, through the fruit of Mary's womb, Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I in the book, I look at Charles Spurgeon, the kind of prince of preachers, 19th century Baptist. And, he preaches against the Eucharist, but basically arguing how could grace work through eating? But he believes sin enters the world through eating. So it's well, why would we have this standard where physical actions like eating can be inherently wicked, but they can't be inherently good? Exactly. And I think it points to a broader distrust of the material world that certain, I don't want to speak with too broad of a brush, but certain aspects of Protestantism can sometimes fall into, where you can have, for instance, you can have evil objects like a Ouija board, tarot cards, those kind of things, and Catholics would agree with this. You don't want that in your house. You're inviting unclean forces. And on the other hand, where Catholicism has things like holy water, blessed objects, relics, these kind of things that, there's not just bad things spiritually, there are also good things spiritually that work through these material ways. A certain chunk of Protestantism, and not a small one, doesn't have that counterbalance. There's only bad or neutral. There's no good. Yeah. And that's a very strange view of the material world that was created by God.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you pointed that out. On the topic of Protestants, one thing you mention in here, which might be a little controversial for any Protestants listening to this, but you discuss how the Protestant view of worship, inside of their churches is maybe not so much worship at all. And to do a little brief, personal aspect to this.
Yeah.
So I was not really raised religious. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I started like going to church regularly, and I started attending this non-denominational church. That was like what was popular from where I was growing up. And I remember, I mean, all we have are our Bibles as Protestants.
Yeah.
So I was pretty acquainted with my Bible, which is missing 7 books, but nonetheless.
Makes it easier.
Exactly. And so I remember just reading the Old Testament, and I was so confused because to me, it was very clear the way that God wanted to be worshiped, and he was very particular about it, was through sacrifice, the sacrifice of animals, offerings of grains, and things of that nature. But in this non-denominational world I was so immersed in, there was no aspect of sacrifice. Worship was simply like singing along with a song. That's how, when we said, oh, we're going to go worship, that's what we meant, is we're going to go sing a song with a bunch of people and maybe put our hands up in the air or something. And I just had this huge disconnect between the Old Testament liturgy and how God wants to be worshiped and this world of singing and listening to pastors preach sermons. And when I found out about the truth, I guess, of what Catholics believe in regards to the Eucharist, which I hadn't heard previously as a non-denominational, I didn't even know that some Christians believed that the Eucharist really is Jesus Christ. I felt like there was actually like this flow, this beautiful flow from the Old Testament to the New Testament and to the church today. And so I'm just curious to hear more of your thoughts on Pact. You mentioned them in the book, but would love to hear it now.
No, I like the way you frame that. And I think you could imagine it almost like past, present, future, because you have the Old Testament worship, say the temple liturgy, that's described throughout the Old Testament. You have the angelic or heavenly liturgy laid out in the book of Revelation as future worship. This is how we worshiped in the past. This is how we will worship one day. And then you look at how we worship right now. And if you're Catholic, it looks like the same author of all three. And I would venture, if you're a non-denominational Protestant, you'd have to say one of these things is not like the others. Like, and often very consciously. That's not just like my observation. You can read works critiquing Catholicism. Say, take, Lorraine Bettner, mid-20th century Presbyterian, has a book just called Roman Catholicism that's just an attack on Catholic teaching. And one of the things that he criticizes the Mass for, he calls it, I believe the word is recudiance of Judaism. Like, just like this is this awful leftover of Judaism that's made its way into Christianity. It's like, well, if your worship doesn't look Jewish, and Jewish worship was established by God, like, why would he build up a system just to be like, actually, I don't really want you to worship me like that. I want you to worship me a totally different way. Why go to all that trouble in the first place to form us to worship him in one way if he means for us to worship him in a totally different way instead? And then this is all somehow directed towards this heavenly worship that looks much more like the Catholic and Old Testament worship than it does like the non-denominational worship. I mean, when you look at the vision of worship in the book of Revelation, it's not just a guy preaching about God in heaven. There's no reference to preaching at all. And again, this is not to knock preaching. It's not to knock any of those things. But at least notice a certain, even if it's an aesthetic similarity, just that should raise questions. I don't think that automatically proves the Catholic case, but it should raise some questions. God seems to care pretty deeply how he's worshipped. When Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, go to offer unholy fire before the Lord, fire from heaven comes down and kills them. They're not worshiping a false god. They're just worshiping the true God in the way they want to worship him, rather than the way he wants to be worshipped. And that alone is displeasing to God. So if our idea of Christian worship is whatever feels good to us, whatever sounds good to us, the one thing we know biblically is that's not it. And one of the reasons that's not it is, if I'm the master of worship, then who am I worshiping? Like, if worship is about giving God what he is owed, and I'm going to do it on my terms and the way I want, it's, like if I get a gift from my wife and it's just football tickets. It's like, I'm not sure that was actually a gift for her. That sounds more like a gift for you. My sisters used to do this to each other, where they would get each other shirts that clearly they just wanted because they knew they were going to steal them. That's not a true gift. And so we can approach worship in that same way, where this feels really good for me. I feel edified. I feel emotionally charged. I feel whatever, but it isn't what God has asked me to do for him. And so if we don't have sight of that, it's actually bad for us because we lose a sense of the difference between us and our Creator. So, and I think a lot of Protestants recognize that, but maybe aren't aware of how that can creep into how we approach worship. That it should not just be an aesthetic question of what do I prefer, because I am not the God of the universe. I'm not the master of worship. So then the last thing, and you teed this up a moment ago, I think was quite right. Maybe I'd put it like this to Protestants watching this. Consider your experience of Sunday worship and ask if there is anything in that would be out of place in the synagogue. Because as much as there's this obvious break between temple worship and Protestant services, many Protestant services are modeled even consciously, even explicitly, off of alleged first century temple liturgies. There are numerous Protestant liturgists who talk about synagogue worship and all this. And to be completely clear, the synagogue, what was going on in the synagogue is really good. People would come together and there'd be reading of scripture, there'd be preaching on it, and it was edifying. And we read in Luke 4 that Jesus' custom on the Sabbath day was to go in and participate in that. So clearly it's not bad. But it is a Bible study. At its heart, it's what we Catholics would call a Bible study. You've gotten together, you've talked about scripture for a while. That's great, that's wonderful. But it's not worship. And how do we know it's not worship? Well, the synagogue is mentioned numerous times in the New Testament. Prayer is mentioned numerous times in the New Testament. Well, I don't know if you've gotten to this part in the book yet. Do you know how many times prayer and the synagogue are mentioned together in the New Testament? Mm-mm. 1. And it's in Matthew 6 where Jesus says not to pray in the synagogues. Mm. And so it's like, wait a second, what's going on here? That he views the synagogue as a good place, but it is not a place of prayer. And strikingly, it's actually not a place of prayer from the Jewish perspective as well. Rabbi Reuven Hammer has a book looking at Jewish worship, and he quotes this first century synagogue inscription that's fairly famous that archaeologists have found that describes what the synagogue is. And the synagogue is a place of gathering, and it's a place where you have water and a place to sleep for travelers. So it's a place you can stay over, and it's a place where you can talk about the Torah, and a place of studying of the Torah. But so if you imagine, like a lot of Catholic churches have like the church, and then next door there's like a parish center. The synagogue is like the parish center. It's for the good of God, but it is not a sacred space in the same way, and it's not a place of prayer and worship. And so Jesus doesn't say don't go to the synagogue, but he compares praying in the synagogues to praying in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. Like the marketplace is great to go to. There's no reason not to go to the marketplace. But if you go and pray your rosary in the marketplace, I'm a little suspicious about your motives. And so that's what he's warning against, that kind of ostentatious worship, or ostentatious prayer, excuse me. So instead, the house of prayer that Jesus refers to is the temple. And that's explicitly what he calls the temple. So you can pray anywhere, go up to your room and pray. He prays in a lonely place, all of that. You can talk to God wherever you want, but don't do it in an ostentatious way like you would do in the synagogue. So I would suggest if everything you are experiencing in Sunday worship could be done in the synagogue, and Jesus didn't consider what was going on in the synagogue as prayer or worship, that's a red flag. That suggests something is missing. And once that's something, you've already talked about it. It's the sacrificial nature. It's giving something to God, and specifically giving to God what he has asked for. And that was something you could only do in the Old Testament in the temple in Jerusalem. And that, of course, is radically changed in the New Testament. But we have to get that right and say, what is the version of the temple now? And what does that look like for Christians?
Yeah, that's great. That's great stuff. I did not get to that part of the book yet, so can't wait for
that's
that.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, but I've never heard that either, so I can't wait for that. What are some parts of the Old Testament that very clearly point to the Eucharist?
Yeah. I mean, the most obvious one would be the Passover lamb. No, maybe I shouldn't say the most obvious one, because there's a lot. You've got, for instance, the manna. Mm-hmm. And so it's worth talking about the manna in the same context as the Passover lamb, because in John 6, Jesus compares himself to the manna, in this Eucharistic sounding way. And we're told, and I believe John 6, verse 4, that this happens at Passover time. So John 6 encourages us to understand Jesus' teaching, the so-called bread of life discourse, through the dual lens of the manna and the Passover lamb. So with the manna, this is the bread from heaven. So you hear people quote, well, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. But in context there, when you read that in its Old Testament context, this is talking about the manna, that the manna was actual spiritual food. And St. Paul calls it spiritual food in 1 Corinthians 10. Now, many Protestants have, when they hear the word spiritual, they imagine not physical. So if it's spiritual food, this must not be physical food. But that's not true. And the manna was clearly also physical food. The people were living off of it physically. But it was spiritual food as well, because the point of the manna was to train them spiritually in reliance upon God. The fact that God was feeding them day after day after day showed that this thing that was on the one hand physical was also spiritual. And so with the Eucharist, we would say this is spiritual food. That doesn't mean it's disembodied. That doesn't mean it's, just an idea floating around. We're not Gnostics. It still is in material existence. We can still see the Eucharist. We can experience and encounter. It's not just an idea, but it is nevertheless a spiritual reality made present in this kind of physical way. That's how the manna worked of old, and that's how the Eucharist works now. This also, shifting gears from the manna to the Passover lamb, one of the objections that I remember hearing in college that I didn't have an answer to is, well, aren't you re-sacrificing Christ on the cross? Because we just talked about how what's missing in many cases in Protestant worship is this sacrificial element. And many Protestants would say, well, we're supposed to be missing the sacrificial element. Christ's sacrifice is once for all. And so if we're re-sacrificing Christ, that's violating everything Hebrews says about the sacrifice. And to that I would say, I think we need a deeper understanding of how sacrifice works. Case in point, consider the Passover. So with the Passover, you have two elements. You have the killing of the lamb. This is on what is sometimes called preparation day. But that is not the end of the sacrifice. So the priest is the one who does the killing of the lamb. And so if you might own a lamb, and then you take the Passover lamb, and you go to the priest, and the priest slaughters the lamb. You wouldn't say, okay, we're done now, because the lamb is dead once for all. Because it is dead once for all, make no mistake. That lamb is, you can't re-sacrifice him in the sense of killing him. But what you can do, and what you must do, is now apply that sacrifice to your own family. And in the Passover sacrifice, so it's done very clearly in a couple of ways. Number one, smearing the blood on the doorposts. This really is shown in the smearing of Christ's blood on the wood of the cross. But then number two, in the eating of the flesh of the lamb. This was required. If you didn't do this, your family would not be spared in the Passover. That this wasn't an optional step in the sacrifice of the Passover. This was when St. Paul says that Christ, our paschal lamb, has been sacrificed in 1 Corinthians 15, he's making this connection so explicit. You can't just say, oh yeah, I believe in the Passover lamb being sacrificed. That is not how the Passover sacrifice works. Eating the flesh was actually necessary. And so when Jesus talks about the need for us to eat his flesh, this makes sense from a sacrificial context. In 1 Corinthians 10, St. Paul tries to explain the Eucharist by comparing it to two things. The food offerings in Judaism in the temple, and the food offerings in paganism at what he calls the table of demons. So these demonic altars, he then contrasts them with the Christian altars, the table of the Lord. And so it's not just like a family table where we gather around and commemorate or memorialize Jesus' action in the past. It's something deeper than that is going on, according to 1 Corinthians 10, because we become partners in the altar. That's the language Paul uses to explain what's going on here. And so there is an altar. Like when Jesus says, if you've got something against your brother, leave your gift before you take it to the altar, he's reminding us that Christianity is going to have altars. An altar is a place of sacrifice. And so we're not re-killing Christ. That step of the sacrificial process is completely done, but we now have to apply the sacrifice. And I find that even though that framing of things is often like novel to many Protestants, they haven't heard it understood in that way because most of us are unaware of how food sacrifices worked in paganism or Judaism because, not many of us have neighbors who are doing animal sacrifice, probably for the best. And so the idea that like eating the animal is actually a part of the sacrifice is lost on many people. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like we're just re-killing the animal. Nope. You're applying the sacrifice. And so I find many Protestants, even though they don't have the sacrificial language to make sense of that in that kind of theological framework, they have an intuitive understanding. And here's why I'd say that. When I talk to Protestants, if I say, when were you saved? Mm-hmm. People will have varying answers to that. Maybe it's when they got baptized. Maybe it's when they prayed the sinner's prayer, or they made some sort of personal dedication to God. Whatever it is. Different people have different stories and different ways they understand their own stories. But you know what I've never heard anyone say? In all the years I've asked people this question, I've never had one person say, "Oh, I was saved on Good Friday." Mm-hmm. Even though, of course, in one sense, everyone who is saved on Good Friday. Everybody, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, you name it, everybody who gets Christianity realizes what Jesus has done on Good Friday now has to be applied to my life in some way. That's not re-sacrificing him, but that is applying the sacrifice and making me a part of it. Because if I'm not a part of it, it doesn't do me any good.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. I haven't thought of it in that way. And I mean, I agree in the sense of when you talked about sort of how Gnosticism has its roots in some Protestant beliefs in some capacity, in terms of the very like spiritualization of even with baptism. Like I've encountered so many Protestants who talk about how you just need to be baptized with the Holy Spirit and not with water. Yeah. But then how do you know when you've been baptized with the Holy Spirit? They seem to want to get away from this physical aspect of creation, Jesus, working through creation to apply those graces to us, and instead just make it a solely spiritual thing.
Yeah, I think many Protestants struggle to know how to work the body and the material realm into their vision of salvation. And we want to be really careful about that. Because like in the most extreme forms, you've got the people in the early church, like the Gnostics and Docetists, who just denied that Jesus came in the flesh at all. And St. John calls them Antichrist, because they literally are. I mean, the word became flesh, and you say flesh is evil. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to say the word became evil. And so an excessive denigration of the body is a red flag. An excessive denigration of the material world, where nothing spiritually good comes through it, it's only spiritually bad, is a huge red flag. It doesn't match up with the New Testament at all. Now, you can find times where St. Paul, for instance, contrasts the spirit and the flesh, but if you have an understanding of what he's doing there, he explicitly talks about, I believe this is in Romans 8, verse 3, but I may be wrong about that. When he talks about the working of the flesh, he talks about it as a darkening of the body and the mind. Mm-hmm. What he means by flesh there is not the body, because he's including these non-bodily processes, like mental ones, that your soul being turned against God is what he means by the flesh. So, for instance, in Galatians 5, when he talks about works of the flesh, Augustine makes the point that many of the works of the flesh he talks about, like strife and enmity, pride, are things you don't need a body to do. How do we know that? Because the devil is guilty of many of these works of the flesh and doesn't have flesh. So clearly by flesh, he does not mean body. He means something different. He means something like our unaided humanity, pitted against God. And so those passages have been misread by many Protestant thinkers. And I've heard people preach in these astonishingly Gnostic-sounding ways on those issues without seemingly being aware that if you denigrate the body and the material world to that level, or if you just treat it as if the body is irrelevant, this is just like the prison we're going to be liberated from, that when we die, we'll finally be free of our body. That is 180 degrees opposed to the Christian message. Like, why would we look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come if the body is bad? Like, the Easter story, when Christ is reunited with his body, would be bad news, because it's like, oh, he went back to jail.
Yeah.
Like, that's... Sure, it's a glorified prison, but it's a prison. That's not a good understanding of the body at all. The body is not a prison. The body is not a sin. It's not a like, oh, it can be a burden in one sense,
Yeah.
sure. And the body is wounded by sin, but so is your soul. And so anytime you fall into like a spirit good, body bad, that is not of Christianity. That is of Christianity's earliest opponent. And so maybe moving that in a positive direction, one of the early Christians, St. Gregory of Nyssa in the late 300s, talks about how if we were just souls, we could be saved by faith alone. Because the way that the soul receives Christ is through faith. But we are wounded and in need of redemption at the level of both the body and the soul. And he comes to heal body and soul. And the way he does that is through faith and by healing the body with things like the Eucharist.
That's amazing. I haven't heard that before. Last thing I'll mention, I think this whole discussion has been great. Some thoughts that were coming to my mind from what we were just saying, it seems like the Protestant denial of the real presence of the Eucharist is more of a symptom than anything, a symptom of their view of a negative view of the body, of the flesh, however you want to define the flesh. You quote some Protestant reformers here in your book who were very, in my opinion, explicitly Gnostic. But even when you take someone like Martin Luther and his view of justification and it being sort of this imputation, this outward thing instead of this inward thing, to me it almost seems like Protestants have this. They haven't fully realized the incarnation of Christ and how that affects our humanity to a deep capacity.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a broad variety of different types of Protestants, but I would say one thing that's striking about Catholicism is how gritty and bodily it is.
Yes.
But one thing that should strike us about Jesus's ministry when he's spitting on guys' tongues to heal them and doing all these healings of bodies is how gritty and bodily it is. If the body was bad, Jesus wouldn't spend 3 years healing bodies as well as souls. Exactly. And so I don't want to speak certainly I don't want to speak for all of Protestantism, but I would say for anyone listening who comes from a tradition that maybe it sounds like what you just described, watch out for that, because that's not what the New Testament paints as the Christian vision of the body. And if you have that, that's going to create a certain set of prejudices and barriers to having a Christian understanding of things like baptism, as you said, or the Eucharist.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Joe,
for
speaking with me. I think we're good.
Great.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.